Silence was the first law of winter in these mountains, a decree written in frost on every pane of glass and every needle of pine. It was a silence that buried sound, the way the snow buried the world. In her small cabin, nestled deep in the Wyoming Territory forest, Lin Yu had come to know its language. It spoke of memory, of loss, of a life left behind across an ocean and another life lost just last spring in the cold, unyielding earth beside her husband. The silence was her companion, her penance, her shroud. Her grey cheongsam, the color of ash and winter skies, was a uniform for her mourning. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the whisper of the wind, a lonely liturgy she had learned by heart. Then, a new sound. A frantic, desperate hammering on her door, a sound so violent it felt like a violation of the season's first law. It was the sound of a world outside her grief, a world she had tried to forget. She froze, her hand hovering over the tea she was steeping. No one came here. The nearest settlement was a 2-day ride in good weather. This was not good weather. The hammering came again, punctuated by a man's raw, broken shout, swallowed by the wind. Curiosity, or perhaps a flicker of an instinct she thought long dead, pulled her to her feet. She unlatched the heavy bar and opened the door a crack. The cold lunged at her, a physical blow. Before her stood a ghost made of snow and desperation, a tall man whose face was a gaunt mask of windburn and fear. But it was not him that held her gaze. In his arms, wrapped in a threadbare horse blanket, were 2 small bundles. From one, a thin, rattling cry escaped. The man's eyes, a startling blue in his haggard face, found hers. "Please," he rasped, the word cracking. "Milk. For my boys. Anything." Their mother, he didn't need to finish. Lin Yu saw it all in the hollows of his cheeks, in the tremor of the arms that held his entire world. She hesitated for only a second, a battle waged and lost in a single heartbeat between the safety of her solitude and the undeniable plea in front of her. The wail from the blanket was a needle piercing the thick fabric of her grief. She pulled the door wide, a silent invitation. The man stumbled inside, bringing the storm with him in a swirl of snow and freezing air. He stood there, dripping on the worn floorboards, a giant brought low, looking utterly lost in the small, warm space. Lin Yu barred the door again, shutting out the howling wind, and turned to face him. The cabin, her sanctuary, felt suddenly crowded, fragile. He hadn't moved, his arms still clenched around the 2 bundles as if he feared they might dissolve. One of the babies began to cry again, a weak, hungry sound that echoed in the quiet room. Lin Yu moved without thinking. She took a small clay pot from the hearth, where a container of goat's milk was kept warm. It was her milk, for her tea, for the thin broth she subsisted on. It was precious. She poured a small amount into a bowl, her hand steady. She gestured for him to sit at the small, rough-hewn table. He sank onto the stool, his body folding with exhaustion. He gently laid the blankets down, revealing 2 tiny, red-faced infants, impossibly small. He watched her, his gaze unwavering, as she dipped a clean strip of linen into the warmed milk. She approached the crying child, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. The man, Jacob, flinched as she reached for the baby, a low growl of pure protective instinct in his throat. "I will not harm him," she said softly, her first words to him. Her voice was rough from disuse. He subsided, watching her with the wariness of a cornered wolf. She gently touched the soaked cloth to the infant's lips. The crying stopped. A tiny mouth latched on with surprising strength, suckling greedily. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the storm, the fire, and the small, contented sounds of a child being fed. That night, the blizzard descended in earnest, a white fury that shook the very bones of the cabin. Escape was impossible. They were trapped together, 3 strangers and a ghost. Jacob had introduced himself, his voice low and gravelly. The boys were named Samuel and David. His wife, Sarah, had succumbed to a fever 4 days prior, on the trail. He was trying to reach his brother's homestead across the ranges, a fool's errand in this weather, but he'd had no choice. He spoke in clipped, broken sentences, as if each word was a stone he had to dredge up from a deep well of pain. Lin Yu listened, saying little. She understood the shape of his grief. It was a mirror to her own, just newer, sharper. After the boys were fed and sleeping in a makeshift cradle by the fire, a profound stillness fell. Jacob sat slumped at the table, his powerful frame defeated by exhaustion, yet his eyes never fully closed. He watched the flames, but his gaze was distant, lost in the fresh hell of his memories. Lin Yu watched him. She saw the way his hand rested near the pistol tucked into his belt, a stark piece of iron and violence in her quiet home. He was a man running from something more than just weather. She cleaned the bowls in silence, the simple, domestic act a strange comfort. In the flickering firelight, their shadows danced on the walls, merging and separating. It felt like a lifetime since another person's shadow had shared this space with hers. The presence of the children, their soft breaths filling the air, had awakened a part of her she had carefully buried with her husband, Bao. A fierce, tender ache bloomed in her chest, a feeling so potent it almost frightened her. She was a wife without a husband, a woman without a child. He was a husband without a wife, a father with 2 sons to save. In the heart of the storm, in this tiny bubble of warmth, they were 2 halves of a shattered whole. The storm raged for 3 days. The world outside the cabin ceased to exist, replaced by a swirling, howling vortex of white. Time blurred into a cycle of feeding the babies, stoking the fire, and sleeping in brief, exhausted shifts. A fragile routine was born from necessity. Jacob, regaining some of his strength, took it upon himself to chop from their dwindling woodpile and perform repairs, his movements economical and precise. He rechinked the logs where the wind found its way in and reinforced the shutter on the window, his broad shoulders filling the space. He worked with a grim determination, a man accustomed to hardship. He moved with the coiled tension of someone perpetually expecting a threat. He never relaxed. Lin Yu observed him as she cared for Samuel and David. The babies were her focus, a purpose that grounded her. She felt the fog of her own sorrow begin to recede, burned away by the immediate, desperate needs of these 2 small lives. One afternoon, as Jacob came in from the lean-to, shaking snow from his coat, she saw him wince, his hand flying to his side. Before he could hide it, she saw the dark stain blooming on his shirt, a patch of crimson against the damp wool. "You are hurt," she stated, her voice leaving no room for argument. He looked at her, his jaw tight. "It's nothing." An old wound. It was not an old wound. She had seen wounds like it before. It was fresh, angry, and poorly tended. She said nothing more, but that night, she left a small pot of yarrow salve and clean bandages on the table. In the morning, they were gone. He never mentioned them, and she never asked. But a silent acknowledgement had passed between them. He was a man with a secret that bled. She could feel the danger he carried, a cold weight in the air that had nothing to do with the winter outside. Her cabin was no longer just a shelter from a storm, it was a hiding place. And she was no longer just a grieving widow, she was a conspirator. On the 5th day, the wind died. A pale, watery sun filtered through the trees, making the endless expanse of snow glitter with a cold, cruel beauty. The world was reborn, pristine and silent. The immediate crisis of the storm had passed, leaving behind a different kind of tension in the cabin. The unspoken questions hung heavy in the air. That evening, as the twins slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in unison, Jacob finally broke the silence. He stared into the fire, his face a mask of harsh lines and shadows. "Her father is the sheriff of Stone Creek County," he began, his voice a low rumble. Sheriff Brody. The name meant nothing to Lin Yu, but the way he said it, laced with a quiet, venomous hatred, told her everything. "He never approved of me. Of Sarah marrying me. I was just a ranch hand. Not good enough for his daughter." He paused, taking a ragged breath. "When she got sick, it happened fast. There was nothing I could do. But he doesn't see it that way. He sees a way to hurt me. A way to take what's left of her." Lin Yu watched him, her hand still in her lap. She understood now. The wound. The constant watchfulness. "He says I was negligent," Jacob continued, his voice thick with rage and grief. He's using the law, his law, to paint me as a killer. He wants the boys. He calls them his legacy, his heirs. To him, they're not children. They're property. Like a prize bull or a deed to land, he finally turned to look at her, his blue eyes burning with a desperate fire. He's not a lawman, Lin Yu. He's a tyrant. He owns the judges, the deputies, everyone. I didn't steal my sons. I'm saving them. The confession settled between them, a heavy, dangerous truth. She was sheltering a fugitive, a man hunted by a corrupt and powerful enemy. The fragile piece of her world was irrevocably shattered. She looked from his desperate face to the sleeping forms of his sons. Her choice was already made. The peace of the new day was a lie. In the late afternoon, as the sun began to cast long, blue shadows across the snow, a new sound intruded. It was faint at first, a rhythmic thudding that was not the wind or a falling branch. It was the sound of horses, many of them, moving through the deep snow. Jacob heard it at the same time. He went utterly still, his head cocked, his body becoming a statue of pure, animal alertness. Every line of him screamed danger. He looked at Lin Yu, and in his eyes, she saw the confirmation of her worst fears. He found us, he whispered, the words barely audible. There was no panic in his voice, only a terrible, grim certainty. Take the boys. The root cellar he moved quickly, checking the load in his pistol, his actions fluid and practiced. He was no longer just a grieving father, he was a cornered man ready to fight. Lin Yu's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum against the encroaching silence. She bundled the sleeping twins, their warmth a small comfort against the terror icing her veins. The sound of the horses grew louder, closer, accompanied by the jingle of harnesses and the low murmur of men's voices. They were circling the cabin. Jacob pushed her toward the heavy trapdoor in the floor. Get in. And do not open it. No matter what you hear. His eyes met hers for a fleeting second, a silent exchange of fear and resolve. She nodded, her throat too tight for words. As she descended the rickety ladder into the cold, earthy darkness of the cellar, she heard a voice boom from outside, a voice full of arrogance and false authority. Jacob Vance! I know you're in there. You have something that belongs to me. Send out my grandsons and I'll be lenient. The voice was cruel, confident. It was the voice of Sheriff Brody. Lin Yu pulled the heavy door shut, plunging herself and the babies into near-total darkness. The cabin, her home, was now a battlefield. The floorboards above her head creaked as Jacob moved into position. Then, Brody's voice again, colder this time. Don't be a fool, Vance. You can't win. You stole my blood. I'm the law here. A heavy silence followed. Lin Yu held her breath, clutching the babies so tightly they stirred in their sleep. She could hear her own blood roaring in her ears. They are my sons. Jacob's roar was primal, the sound of a father defending his young. It was followed by the explosive crack of a rifle, and the world dissolved into chaos. A window shattered overhead, showering glass onto the floor. Another shot answered from Jacob's pistol. The cabin, which had been a vessel of silence, was now filled with the deafening symphony of violence, splintering wood, the thunder of guns, the enraged shouts of men. Lin Yu pressed herself against the cold earth wall of the cellar, shielding the infants with her body. They had awoken and begun to cry, their terrified wails adding to the cacophony. She tried to soothe them, murmuring words in a language they couldn't understand, her voice a trembling thread in the maelstrom. The house groaned under the assault. Bullets tore through the thin walls, thudding into the logs with sickening finality. She could smell the acrid bite of gunpowder filtering through the floorboards. Above her, Jacob was a phantom, his movements quick and desperate, a shot from the window, the sound of him scrambling to the other side of the room, another shot from the door. He was one man against many. The fight was a frantic, brutal ballet she could only hear, not see. Each gunshot was a hammer blow to her nerves, each moment stretching into an eternity of terror. She was trapped in the dark heart of the battle, a helpless guardian to the two small lives who were the cause of it all. Then came a new smell, sharp and terrifyingly familiar: smoke. It snaked through the cracks in the trapdoor, a ghostly harbinger of a new kind of death. They were burning the cabin. A man outside laughed, a jagged, cruel sound. Burn him out. Smoke the rat from his hole. The crackle of the fire began, a low whisper at first, then a hungry roar. Heat began to radiate down through the floorboards. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lin Yu. The air in the cellar grew thick, heavy. The babies were coughing, their cries turning into choked gasps. Above, the gunfire had lessened, replaced by the triumphant, devouring sound of the flames. This was it. This was the end. They were trapped. She could hear Jacob coughing, his movements becoming slower, more labored. The floor above her was growing hot to the touch. The entire structure groaned, the sound of a dying beast. Her home, the place where she had sealed herself away with her memories, was becoming her tomb. The fire was erasing it all, the table where she had taken her lonely meals, the hearth that had kept her from freezing, the bed where she had wept for her husband. All of it was turning to ash. In the roaring darkness, a profound and terrible clarity came to her. She had been hiding from life, and now death had come to find her anyway. She pressed her face against the warm bundles in her arms, inhaling the scent of milk and innocence, a final, desperate prayer forming on her lips. A loud crash from above signaled a part of the roof giving way. It was over. They had lost. Suddenly, the trapdoor was wrenched open. A blast of heat and thick, black smoke poured into the cellar. Jacob's silhouette was framed against the raging fire, a dark angel in an apocalypse of his own making. Lin Yu, he choked out, his voice raw. He was bleeding from a gash on his forehead, his face smudged with soot and fury. The back wall. Now! He scrambled down the ladder, ignoring the flames that licked at the opening. He grabbed a discarded pickaxe from the corner of the cellar, something Bao had used for digging in the rocky soil. With desperate, superhuman strength, he began attacking the earthen wall at the far end of the cellar, the one that backed onto the slope behind the cabin. The foundation is loose here, he gasped between frantic swings. It leads out under the porch. Smoke billowed around them, stealing the air from their lungs. Lin Yu, her eyes streaming, her body shaking, watched him work. He was a force of pure will, refusing to be consumed. The fire roared, a monstrous beast trying to claw its way down into their last refuge. Wood splintered and dirt flew. He was making a hole, a frantic burrow into the frozen earth. Go, he yelled, pointing to the small opening he'd created. Get them through. She didn't hesitate. She crawled on her hands and knees, pushing the bundled twins ahead of her through the narrow, dark tunnel. Cold, clean air hit her face. She wriggled out from under the burning porch into the biting snow, gasping. She turned back, her heart seizing with fear. Jacob was right behind her, shoving the pickaxe out before pulling himself through the hole just as a massive beam from the porch collapsed in a shower of sparks and flame, sealing the exit. They scrambled away, crawling through the snow into the darkness of the forest as the cabin, her entire world for the past year, surrendered to the fire. It roared into the night sky, a magnificent, terrible pillar of light, a funeral pyre for a life that was already over. They ran. They stumbled through the deep, clinging snow, fueled by adrenaline and terror. The orange glow of the burning cabin lit their way for a time before being swallowed by the immense, cold darkness of the forest. The shouts of Brody and his men faded behind them, their attention still fixed on the inferno, certain their quarry was perishing within it. Jacob led the way, one arm wrapped around his wounded side, the other helping to guide Lin Yu, who clutched the two precious bundles to her chest. Every breath was a shard of ice in their lungs. The silence of the winter forest, once a comfort to her, was now menacing, full of unseen dangers. But it was also their shield. They moved for what felt like hours, putting as much distance as they could between themselves and the ruin of her home. Finally, exhausted to the point of collapse, Jacob spotted it, a small, abandoned trapper's lean-to, barely a hovel, but it was shelter. Inside, they huddled together for warmth, the four of them a tiny knot of life in a vast, indifferent wilderness. The twins, miraculously, had fallen asleep. As the first hint of dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of bruised purple and soft gray, they finally stopped moving. In the faint light, they looked at each other. They were covered in soot, their clothes were torn, they were homeless and hunted. But they were alive. Jacob reached out, his hand hesitating before gently brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. It was a simple phrase, yet it held the weight of everything they had just endured. Lin Yu simply nodded, looking down at the sleeping faces of Samuel and David. The fire had taken her home, her sanctuary of grief, but it had given her this. A reason. A purpose. A family forged not of blood, but of fire and desperation and a shared will to survive. The past was a pyre of smoking ash behind them. Ahead lay only the vast, unknown, and unforgiving expanse of the mountains, and the slim, dangerous promise of a future they would have to build together. Hey, it's the narrator here. Thanks for joining us for that journey into the heart of the frozen West. It makes you wonder, doesn't it? What is a home? Is it the four walls that shelter us, or is it the people we choose to shelter in our hearts? Lin Yu and Jacob lost everything they had, but in that loss, they found each other. If you felt that connection, if their story of survival and newfound family moved you, do me a favor and hit that like button, and share it with someone who loves a story about hope found in the darkest of places. And don't forget to subscribe for more tales like this. Now, I'll leave you with a question to ponder. When everything is burned away, what is the one thing you would run towards? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, and keep the fire of hope burning.